Thanks, Andrew. Oops. Thanks to Andrew and James Fodor for having me along. I'm actually just some schmo, a Christian layperson who has some interest in the effective altruism movement and I suppose how it might interact with Christianity and Christians. So I'm just going to make sort of 5 minutes worth of remarks about, or just some comments to trigger a panel, which will happen a bit later on with myself and a guy called Rob Martin, James and Andrew. Okay, so first question is, what is effective altruism? Now, I know we've heard a lot about this over the course of the summer, but it does seem like there are a couple of different conceptions of it. So effective altruism, I suppose with a partial scope, you might call doing good better, or the use of evidence and analysis to take actions that help others as much as possible. So doing good better is obviously William Caskell's book, and the second quote is from Rob Wiblin, his blog post of his. On the other hand, there seems to be also a bit more of a kind of a fuller view of effective altruism, which is, and this is obviously the title of Peter Singer's book, that we should do the most good we can. And that, effective altruists need not be utilitarians, but they do agree with utilitarians that all other things being equal, we ought to do the most good we can. And that's from The Most Good You Can Do. And then I suppose you've got sort of the more rigorously utilitarian side of the movement, which suggests, we should really take the point of view of the universe. We should take an agent-neutral view of things in order to decide what's right. We should kind of, sort of forget who we are per se and consider the maximization of some sum, whether that's utility or pleasure minus pain. That people seem to differ on that, but we should consider the sum of that, and it concerns the mind states of conscious beings. And the idea is that maximizing the overall sum of some quantity over conscious beings, that's some way especially or uniquely rational as a way of thinking about what the right or the best thing to do is. So there are some parallels to these kinds of ideas in Christianity. So Jesus has a bunch of parables, and there are some EA parables, like the drowning child story and play pumps. We've heard plenty about play pumps this weekend. And there are some parables in the teaching of Jesus which do actually roughly correspond to concepts that are big in EA. So the concept of scope neglect, which the drowning child parable kind of picks up on. You could argue that the story of the Good Samaritan, which Jesus tells in response to someone who asks about, essentially, what it means to love your neighbour. The question is, who is my neighbour? And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan in response to that. Similarly, there's the parable of the Minas, which I suppose has teaches about sort of being effective and bold with what we've been given by God in doing good. And similarly, in terms of the obligation to help people who are in desperate poverty, there's the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which also actually contains one of the most graphic descriptions of hell in the Bible, which is interesting. I'd also like to put in a little pitch for biblical injunctions against animal cruelty. So Peter Singer cited Aquinas and Aristotle, basically saying that animals exist for the sake of humans, and that the only problem with being cruel to animals is that it might make us disposed towards being cruel towards humans. But there are some passages in the Bible which, for example, prescribe against being cruel with one's animals. I suppose they're still property or something like that. And also, and this I guess ties in with what we heard from David Pearce yesterday, there is a kind of potential vision of a future state where humans and animals live together, although that's quite controversial. But I'd say there are also some tensions between Christianity and the sort of core principles of the effective altruist movement, at least, as they're often taken. So one is to do with what goodness is. So in the very early in the Bible, the opening creation narrative, the first use of the word good is that God created, and it was good. So I think in some respect it's natural for Christians to think of goodness as existing in things, including things like flowers and trees and the environment, and not primarily in mind states. And similarly, this idea that goodness can exist in things rather than just in sort of the sum over mind states possibly seems to fit a bit better with virtue ethics, where the notion of being good precedes in a logical and motivational way the idea of doing good or improving the state of things. Finally, I'd say Christians would believe that knowing God is a very important human end and a human good. And that will obviously influence our, choices of what we think is important. And another difference is that I'd say Christians have a fairly strong idea of concept of evil and also a concept of justice. So here's an instance of a quote from a prophet Amos, who says, "Just therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from their levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine." So it's kind of condemnation of the rich and saying that they're going to experience futility in wealth that is gained unjustly. And these ideas of sort of forgiveness and recompense and reconciliation, I think, are quite key to Christianity, like absolutely essential, but they don't naturally come out in a utilitarian framework. If Andrew were to come up here and sort of deck me, I think from a Christian point of view, there would be something that needs to be resolved. It's not just that it's sort of harmed the total happiness of sentient beings from now until forever. There's actually something that needs to be resolved there. Similarly, distributive justice, I'd say, for Christians is kind of a good end in and of itself. And here are some quotes actually from The Most Good You Can Do, where Peter Singer is quite self-conscious about being very ecumenical in trying to make effective altruism appealing. And here's a quote from Ambrose of Milan, and there's another from Aquinas in the book about essentially the importance of sharing wealth. And of course that will end up being important to utilitarians, but I suppose it's only sort of incidentally important in the sense that the total happiness is kind of what counts. Finally, I thought I'd pick up on a couple of things that David Pearce mentioned yesterday. So I suppose that's kind of a bit of a fringe topic within EA, it seems, but Christians are quite big on human transformation in some respects. So we believe that people can be born again, like can be radically changed by God. There's a hope that in the future, in what is sometimes called heaven, but you might also call the new heavens and the new earth, that God will actually sort of give us new bodies, which I suppose sounds quite strange, but I think it does actually resonate with some of the more extreme ends of the EA movement in terms of the kind of hopes and aspirations that people might have with respect to technology. But the attitudes of Christians towards that technology will probably vary. Okay, so finally, just a few remarks on the movement itself and Christianity. So I think this scope question will sort of probably influence the extent to which Christians feel part of the movement. And it is something that is kind of discussed within EA itself. It seems like some people think, well, I just happen to want to do the most good I can. Whereas others think, no, it is somehow uniquely sort of rational and good to maximize some quantity. And to the extent that we're not doing that, we're sort of being selfish. And maybe we can sort of fudge that by saying, it's good that we feel good. But in any case, I think that the scope question will significantly influence the extent to which Christians feel sort of comfortable coming along to events like this, which I don't think that is actually the whole effective altruist movement by any means. But I think it's also the case that, like, in reading The Most Good You Can Do, Peter Singer, it seems, is actually making more of a virtue ethical argument than is obvious, in that it seems that the thesis of the book is not you should do the most good you can do, but rather you can flourish doing a lot of good. Hence, he's got a lot of emphasis on concrete examples of people giving away a lot of the kinds of choices they make and so on. And so I think that this kind of, you might call it a softer message or a more virtue-oriented message will probably be more palatable to Christians and also just to your typical Joe Blow. There's a question of self-identity, so I'm not sure whether I should self-identify as an effective altruist. I'm very, very grateful that effective altruism has sort of made viable giving away a lot of money, which I basically think, Christians should do it, and I'm planning to do it, and I'm very grateful that EA has sort of brought it to light and shown that you can flourish while doing it. On the other hand, I don't really, as you've heard, I have some reservations about what you might call the core philosophy of the effective altruist movement. So I'm not sure whether I should identify as an EA or whether the movement should have people like myself identifying as EAs. And a final thought about the movement is that it seems that many of us here, including myself, I suppose, we're young. The conference was described as being about people who are kind of really ambitious to do good, and we're making career decisions and so on and so forth. I don't think that your typical Joe Blow is in that sort of position. And so it seems to me that people who I suppose walk the walk to some extent, but can't get as excited about the ideas or about, debates about wild animal suffering or that kind of thing, the extent to which we can or should feel part of the movement, I think, is up for the movement to decide. All right, so that's all I've got to say. Thank you.